Welcome to the IT Interview Challenger channel. We provide a collection of questions and answers primarily focused on IT knowledge to help you prepare for upcoming interviews, practice for exams, or just boost your professional skills. We hope you'll find real value from tuning in.
How can a startup company increase security controls around SSH access to its Amazon EC2 instances while also enabling auditing of commands?
The best strategy is to create an IAM role with the Amazon SSM Managed Instance Core Managed policy and attach it to all EC2 instances. Then, remove all security group rules, allowing inbound access on port 22. The engineers should install the AWS Systems Manager Session Manager plugin and use the Start Session API call to access the instances.
How can a company limit AWS costs for developers using AWS organizations?
The company can create a fixed monthly budget for each developer's account using AWS budgets, implement an IAM policy to restrict access to costly services, and set up an alert action to notify via Amazon's simple notification service when the budget is reached, triggering an AWS Lambda function to terminate services.
How would you migrate Lambda functions and an Amazon Aurora database from one AWS account to another while minimizing downtime?
I would use AWS Resource Access Manager to share the Lambda functions and the Aurora database with the target account and grant the target account permission to clone the Aurora database.
How can a company make its Python script for data processing more scalable and reduce management overhead?
The company can migrate the script to a container image running on Amazon Elastic Container Service with AWS Fargate. Then create an AWS Lambda function that triggers the Fargate task whenever a new file is uploaded to S3.
How would you ensure high availability and disaster recovery for a new online web application on AWS?
I would create a VPC in both US East 1 and US West 1. In the US East 1 VPC, I would set up an application load balancer across multiple availability zones and an auto-scaling group for EC2 instances. I would replicate this configuration in the US West 1 VPC, create a Route 53 hosted zone, and enable health checks with a failover routing policy for each load balancer.
How can a company enable its IT support workers to access the AWS Management Console using their existing Active Directory credentials?
The most cost-effective solution is to create an organization in AWS Organizations, enable all features, set up an AD connector to link to the company's on-premises Active Directory, configure IAM Identity Center with the AD connector as the identity source, and then create permission sets that map to the existing groups in Active Directory.
How can you improve upload performance for users in Australia using an Amazon S3 bucket located in the US East region?
I would enable S3 transfer acceleration on the S3 bucket and configure the app to use the transfer acceleration endpoint for uploads. Additionally, I would configure the app to break the video files into chunks and use a multi-part upload for transferring files to Amazon S3.
How can you ensure that an application can reestablish connections to an Amazon RDS for MySQL multi-AZ DB instance without requiring a restart after a failover?
I would create an RDS proxy, configure the existing RDS endpoint as a target, and then update the connection settings in the application to point to the RDS proxy endpoint.
How would you design a solution in the AWS Cloud for thousands of devices connecting and using the MQTT protocol with unique X509 certificates?
I would set up an Amazon API Gateway HTTP API and a network load balancer. Then, I would create integration between the API Gateway and the NLB, configure a mutual TLS certificate authorizer on the API, and run an MQTT broker on an Amazon EC2 instance that the NLB targets.
How would you enforce a company policy that restricts engineers to provision only approved resources using AWS CloudFormation?
I would update the IAM policy for the engineer's IAM role to permit only the provisioning of approved resources and AWS CloudFormation. Then, I would use AWS CloudFormation templates to create the stacks.
What storage strategy would you recommend for an application that ingests millions of small records per minute and has specific durability and retrieval requirements?
I would recommend storing each record in an Amazon DynamoDB table, configured for scale, and using the time to live feature to automatically delete records older than 120 days.
What solution would you recommend for ensuring the highest availability of a MySQL database on AWS for an e-commerce website?
I would configure read replicas on Amazon RDS. If there is a disruption, I would promote a cross-region read replica to be a standalone DB instance and direct traffic to it. Then, I would create a replacement read replica using the promoted DB instance as its source.
How can Example Corp connect its on-premise servers to VPC-B with the least operational effort?
Example Corp can modify the site-to-site VPN's virtual private gateway definition to include both VPC-A and VPC-B.
How would you modify an application that relies on a legacy SMTP service to send emails using Amazon's Simple Email service?
I would configure the application to connect to Amazon SES using a TLS wrapper. Then I would create an IAM role with the necessary permissions and attach it to an Amazon EC2 instance.
What solution would you recommend for generating a cost report for multiple AWS accounts after a company acquisition?
I would use the Price List Query API to collect spending information from the accounts, and then create a specialized template in AWS Cost Explorer for the finance department to build reports.
How would you address the performance issues of an overloaded API server and high write latency in an IoT platform on AWS?
I would leverage Amazon Kinesis data streams and AWS Lambda to ingest and process the raw data. Additionally, I would re-architect the database tier to use Amazon DynamoDB instead of an RDS MySQL instance.
What actions would you recommend to improve latency for an electronic document management system running on AWS outside of Europe?
I would enable S3 transfer acceleration on the S3 bucket and ensure the web application uses transfer acceleration signed URLs. Additionally, I would change the API gateway regional endpoints to edge-optimized endpoints.
How would you optimize the storage costs for photos and videos that are accessed infrequently after 30 days?
I would configure an S3 lifecycle policy to transition the image and video objects from S3 Standard to S3 Glacier Deep Archive after 30 days.
How can a company analyze its S3 storage trends to identify the appropriate storage class for its objects?
The company can use S3 storage class analysis and import the data trends into an Amazon QuickSight dashboard to analyze those trends.
How would you define infrastructure as code for a company expanding its cloud infrastructure across multiple AWS regions and accounts?
I would use AWS organizations and AWS CloudFormation stack sets to deploy a CloudFormation template from an account with the necessary IAM permissions.
How would you define infrastructure as code for a company expanding its AWS deployments across multiple regions and accounts?
I would use AWS organizations and AWS CloudFormation stack sets to deploy a CloudFormation template from an account that has the necessary IAM permissions.
How would you upgrade a CI/CD pipeline for a monolithic application being refactored for AWS to support frequent releases and quick rollbacks?
I would specify AWS Elastic Beanstalk to stage in a secondary environment for the CI/CD pipeline. Then, I would swap the staging and production environment URLs for deployment.
How would you provide least privilege access for EC2 instances to an Amazon Aurora DB cluster?
I would add an inbound rule to the EC2 instances security group, specifying the DB cluster's security group as the source over the default Aurora port. I would also add an outbound rule to the EC2 instances security group, specifying the DB cluster's security group as the destination over the same port.
What is the most cost-effective solution for a company wanting to change its internal cloud billing strategy for business units using AWS?
The best solution is to configure AWS budgets in the organization's management account. This allows for budget alerts grouped by application, environment, and owner. Additionally, each business unit can be added to an Amazon SNS topic for alerts, and Cost Explorer can be used in the management account to create monthly reports for each unit.
How can a company using AWS CloudFormation prevent the accidental deletion of important data when a production stack is deleted?
The company can modify the CloudFormation templates to add a deletion policy attribute to the RDS and EBS resources.
What steps would you take to determine if inbound traffic to a private EC2 instance is unsolicited from the internet?
I would open the Amazon CloudWatch console, select the log group for the NAT Gateway's Elastic Network Interface and the private instance's Elastic Network Interface. Then I would run a query, filtering for the destination address as like 198.51 and 100.2, and the source address as like 203.0 row, and use the stats command to sum the bytes transferred by those addresses.
How would you implement encryption at rest for S3 buckets in a company with multiple accounts?
I would turn on server-side encryption with Amazon S3 managed encryption keys on both S3 buckets and then encrypt the existing objects using an S3 copy command in the AWS CLI.
What solution would you recommend for querying and analyzing large amounts of unstructured data stored in an Amazon S3 bucket while managing costs?
I would recommend using S3 Select to query the data and creating an S3 lifecycle policy to transition data older than 1 year to S3 Glacier Deep Archive.
How would you transfer 600 TB of compressed data from an on-premises network-attached storage system to AWS cost-effectively?
I would order several AWS Snowball Edge storage optimized devices through the AWS Management Console, configure them with a destination S3 bucket, copy the data to the devices, and then ship the devices back to AWS.
How would you automate the processing of forms that are uploaded to an application running on AWS?
I would extend the system with an application tier that utilizes AWS step functions and AWS Lambda. This tier would use Amazon Textract and Amazon Comprehend for optical character recognition on the forms when they are uploaded. The output would be stored in Amazon S3, and I would parse this output to extract the necessary data before submitting it to the target system's API.
How would you refactor an on-premises order processing platform in the AWS Cloud while minimizing operational overhead?
I would create an Amazon machine image of the web server VM, then set up an Amazon EC2 auto-scaling group that uses the AMI along with an application load balancer. I would also implement Amazon MQ to replace the on-premises messaging queue and configure Amazon Elastic Kubernetes service to host the order processing backend.
How would you configure AWS WAF web ACLs to improve the security of a web application without affecting legitimate traffic?
I would set the action of the web ACL rules to count and enable AWS WAF logging. Then I would analyze the requests for false positives and modify the rules accordingly. Over time, I would change the action of the web ACL rules from count to block.
How would you improve the management of common security group rules across multiple AWS accounts in an organization?
I would create a new customer-managed prefix list in the security team's AWS account, populate it with all internal CIDR ranges, and share it with the organization using AWS Resource Access Manager. Then, I would notify the owners of each AWS account to allow the new prefix list ID in their security groups.
What is the most cost-effective solution for designing a scalable AWS client VPN for employees working remotely?
The best solution is to create a client VPN endpoint in the main AWS account and configure the necessary routing to allow access to internal applications.
How would you address inconsistent response times and increased error rates in an application running on AWS that calls third-party services synchronously?
I would use an Amazon Simple Queue service queue to store events and invoke the Lambda function.
How can the marketing team securely access data stored in an S3 bucket by the sales team across different AWS accounts?
I would create an IAM role in the sales account that grants access to the S3 bucket. Then, the marketing account can assume this IAM role to access the bucket, and I would update the QuickSight role to establish a trust relationship with the new IAM role.
How would you approach migrating a Microsoft SQL Server always-on cluster to an AWS Managed Database Service?
I would use the AWS Schema Conversion tool to translate the database schema to Amazon RDS for MySQL, and then employ AWS Database Migration Service to migrate the data from the on-premises databases to Amazon RDS.
How would you provide a design team access to a production account S3 bucket while minimizing risk to other parts of the web application?
First, I would create a new IAM policy in the production account that allows read and write access to the S3 bucket. Then, I would create a role in the development account, attach this policy to the role, and define the production account as a trusted entity. Finally, I would create a group in the development account for the design team users and attach a policy that allows the STS assume role action on the role in the production account.
How would you address performance bottlenecks in a single instance AWS Elastic Beanstalk application that has high CPU utilization?
I would create a new Elastic Beanstalk application. Select a load-balanced environment type, choose all availability zones, and add a scale-out rule that activates if the maximum CPU utilization exceeds 85% for 5 minutes.
What would you recommend to help a finance company's MySQL database handle increased load during month-end reporting?
I would suggest a one-time migration of the database cluster to Amazon RDS, along with creating additional read replicas to manage the load during that period.
How would you modernize a stable Java application with complex dependencies on VMs by migrating it to AWS with minimal code changes?
I would migrate the application code to a container that runs in AWS Lambda and build an Amazon API Gateway REST API with Lambda integration to interact with the application.
How would you redesign an asynchronous HTTP application hosted as an AWS Lambda function to support failover to another AWS region?
I would create an Amazon Simple Queue service queue and configure API Gateway to direct traffic to the SQS queue instead of the Lambda function. The Lambda function would then pull messages from the queue for processing.
How can the HR department ensure that other departments cannot share their reserved instance discounts?
They can use the organization's management account to turn off reserved instance sharing for the HR department's production AWS account in the AWS Billing and Cost Management console.
How would you troubleshoot an unhealthy EC2 instance in an auto-scaling group?
I would suspend the auto-scaling group's terminate process and then use Session Manager to log in to the unhealthy instance.
How would you manage AWS WAF rules across multiple AWS accounts with minimal operational overhead?
I would use AWS Control Tower to manage the WAF rules across the organization. I would store account numbers and organizational units in AWS Key Management Service and update it as needed. IAM users would be created in member accounts to allow AWS Control Tower in the management account to create and update WAF rules.
What would you recommend for securing database credentials in an AWS Lambda function that retrieves data from an Amazon Aurora database?
I would save the database credentials in AWS Secrets Manager, set up password rotation, and change the IAM role for the Lambda function to allow access to Secrets Manager. The Lambda function would then retrieve the credentials from Secrets Manager and enforce HTTPS on the connection to Amazon S3.
How can a solutions architect limit the EC2 instance types that developers can launch in an AWS environment?
They can create a new IAM policy that specifies the allowed instance types and then attach that policy to an IAM group that includes the developer's accounts.
How would you address the issue of missing project tags on Amazon EC2 instances across multiple AWS accounts?
I would use Amazon Inspector to identify resources with missing tags, create an IAM policy to deny instance launches without the project tag, and set up an AWS config aggregator to collect data on missing tags.
What components would you use to create a hybrid monitoring solution for a PostgreSQL database that is struggling with heavy ingestion and storage issues?
I would use Amazon Kinesis Data Firehose to buffer events and create an AWS Lambda function to process and transform those events. Additionally, I would configure Amazon Elasticsearch Service to receive the events and use the Kibana endpoint for near real-time visualizations and dashboards.
How would you reduce costs related to high NAT gateway charges in a multi-AZ VPC environment that uses Amazon Kinesis data streams?
I would add an interface VPC endpoint for Kinesis data streams to the VPC and ensure that the endpoint policy allows traffic from the applications.
How can a retail company route network traffic from its on-premises data center into AWS VPCs in multiple regions, ensuring high availability?
The solution involves creating a private virtual interface from the DXA connection into a Direct Connect gateway and another from the DXB connection into the same gateway for high availability. Both the EU West 1 and US East 1 transit gateways should be associated with the Direct Connect gateway, and then the transit gateways need to be peered to support cross-region routing.
What steps would you take to ensure that new IAM users in AWS are automatically created with no access and that the security team is notified for approval?
First, I would create an Amazon Event Bridge rule to detect the Create User event from CloudTrail. Then, I would invoke an AWS Step Function State Machine to remove access for the user. Finally, I would use Amazon Simple Notification Service to notify the security team.
What steps would you take to migrate a company to AWS while ensuring a multi-account structure with managed access and private network traffic?
I would enable AWS Security Hub in all accounts to manage cross-account access and collect findings through AWS CloudTrail to enforce MFA login. Then I would set up AWS IAM Identity Center to create permission sets with required MFA for existing accounts. Finally, I would create IAM users and groups, configure MFA for all users, and set up Amazon Cognito user pools and identity pools for access management.
How can a company reduce costs for their Amazon EC2 instances and RDS databases while minimizing operational effort?
The best approach would be to create an Amazon Event Bridge rule that runs once a day. This rule would trigger an AWS Lambda function to start or stop instances based on their tags, day, and time.
What could be causing the 429 too many requests error messages for premium tier customers using the API?
The likely cause is that the company reached its API gateway account limit for calls per second.
How would you integrate a third-party security tool with an AWS deployment for a web application while ensuring high availability?
I would deploy the security tool on EC2 instances in a new auto-scaling group within the existing VPC and provision a gateway load balancer for each availability zone to redirect traffic to the security tool.
What solution would you propose for optimizing data analysis from IoT sensors with unique proprietary formats?
I would create an AWS transfer for SFTP server, update the IoT sensor code to send the information as a CSV file through SFTP, then use AWS Glue to catalog the files and Amazon Athena for analysis.
What steps would you take to migrate and modernize applications on AWS while ensuring seamless communication with multiple VPCs and routing through the on-premises data center?
I would create a direct connect gateway and a transit gateway in the central network account, then attach the transit gateway to the direct connect gateway using a transit virtual interface. I would also share the transit gateway with other accounts and attach the VPCs to it. Lastly, I would provision only private subnets and open the necessary routes on the transit gateway and customer gateway for outbound internet traffic through NAT services in the data center.
How would you enforce a centralized process for purchasing and modifying reserved instances across multiple AWS accounts?
I would ensure that all accounts are part of an organization in AWS organizations with all features enabled. Then I would create a service control policy that denies the actions for purchasing and modifying reserved instances, attaching it to each organizational unit.
How can you reduce the outage time of an Amazon RDS for MySQL database during a failover test?
I would use Amazon Elasticache for Redis in front of the database, implement RDS proxy in front of the database, and create an RDS for MySQL read replica.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel to keep up with our upcoming videos. See you next time.